outdoor spaces with small steps. And a lot of this is really about being incremental and doing small things over time, and they can be cumulative, and you can add more things in. Because what I'm trying to do is make it as easy as possible for people to do these sort of things that will change how their at-home habitat can be welcoming to wildlife. So I'm going to go ahead and advance the screen. So just a little bit about me, so you know kind of who's here on the other side of the screen. And I work at South Mountain Community College. I'm a librarian there actually, and I started the Maricopa Native Seed Library and Pollinator Pathway in the last couple of years as an attempt to get people to do more, gardening for wildlife with native plants. And I've been doing this gardening for about 15 years, and my garden has really taught me so much of what I'll be sharing with you today. I do have some background in biology, and there will be segments of this where you're getting little mini biology lessons because I think you have to understand that biology underneath and behind this to be able to sort of, implement some of these practices. And I'm also active in the Native Plant Society, and I'm really biased toward native plants. I love them. I'm very excited about them. And so, just a little bit about the Maricopa Native Seed Library. That's a major project I've been running, and it's part of the Maricopa Community Colleges. 'Cause that's where I work. And there's 6 locations in the valley at 6 of the community colleges. If you go on the website, you can see the locations. I also do pop-ups and at different events and things like that as well. And so that'll be referenced a little bit. And the Maricopa Pollinator Pathway will be referenced as well quite a bit because kind of a next step to getting, besides supplying seeds for people to create habitat at home, this pollinator pathway is a way to create habitat at home through guidelines that experts have actually informed, and it is free, and I'll be talking about it. And next week's workshop, which I'll talk about as well, we'll really be focusing on this as well. But I just wanted to kind of let you know what that was because it's going to come up at certain times. So there's 3 overall kind of parts to what we'll be discussing, and after each part, there'll be time for questions. And so part 1 is really the why. Why do we want to do this? And why are native plants so important in this sort of this process? Why are they so central to this process? And then the second step or part is really how to take some typical Phoenix homes, yards and other places, and how you might begin to modify them. And then part 3 is going a little bit deeper. It's kind of, though, it doesn't go super deep into plant selection, planting, and maintenance, but it gives you a taste of that. And then next week, there'll be a deeper dive on some of these topics as well. So there was something else I was going to mention. Oh, and you're going to get an email after the workshop with the PDF of this presentation and all. I checked to make sure all the links are clickable, so you don't have to try to, write anything down or things like that. You should be able to get to all that. And all the pictures, they're marked as a habitat of, and it has like a last name and then a habitat. These are actual homeowners or others, not just homeowners, but actual people who live in the valley or beyond, because it's still beyond that. Most of them are Maricopa County that have signed up for the free pollinator habitat program, the Maricopa Pollinator Pathway. And so you can see things that are possible just as we kind of go through. So, and there's one up here. So this is really about, kind of the why, the underneath. And I have 3 main points, but I think there's a lot of others that can be made. And the first one is that the Sonoran Desert really needs us. And what I'm calling for is something called urban restoration. That is bringing the wild to the homes or the gardens, the parks, the schools, the different places that we have outdoor spaces. And they don't have to be large. They don't have to even have ground. They could be containers or pots. And I'm calling for, kind of this urban restoration or what we call habitat at home as a way to help our wildlands because I think scientists and others are realizing more and more that our wildlands are really too small, that, as human development continues and, wildlands get fragmented and they're also threatened by things like wildfires and droughts, we also need the places that we live, work, and play, whether they're urban, suburban, or rural, to also support wildlife. And so that's kind of, and we're going to get into that, some of the ecological aspects. It also makes economic sense if you start to incorporate native desert plants that do support wildlife. It's actually less time consuming, less water use, so you can save money. So just from that economic sense, I think there's other economic arguments that maybe can be made as well, but I think that's a big one just from the individual person's perspective. And then joy, I mean, we forget about this part and things, but this is a really joyful process. I can't tell you I've lived a long, I don't say I lived a long time, but in the multiple decades I've lived now, I've had lots of joyful experiences in my life, but one of the ones that have been the most joyful has been the process of bringing wildlife to my outdoor space. And for those that might be experiencing climate anxiety, it's a way that you can take action in your sphere of influence, what you have direct control over. And there are lots of health benefits to this, um, related to mood, related to blood pressure, and many others related to native plant gardening and just gardening in general. So let's talk a little bit about, we're going to get into a little bit of the first biology lesson here and talk about why you need native plants. So you need native plants because our native wildlife relies on these plants for many things. Three main things that living things have to do. They have to eat. Well, plants don't eat, but I'm saying wildlife, it has to eat. It has to have a food source. It has to have shelter, and it has to be able to reproduce. And so native insects, birds, reptiles, and mammals, they all rely on native plants. These are just two examples with the seep willow, and you can see there's actually several species of butterfly there that are using that seep willow on the left, and a couple of other insects I can't identify. And then on the right, you can see queen butterfly larvae that have the eggs were laid on the plant. Now we have the caterpillars or larvae. There's two of them there, and then hopefully they will go through metamorphosis, become butterflies if they survive through the stage they're in. The point being that these things can't happen without the native plants. These things would not be occurring. Now, there are non-natives, and we'll talk more about that, but really there's a lot of relationships that are involved here between native plants and wildlife. So we have to talk about what is a native plant. And this is a little bit of kind of a biology lesson. And so I have a definition here and some points. So a native plant, and look at the parts where it's in bold. It's a plant that has evolved or developed in a given place over a relatively long period of time in order to develop complex and essential relationships with the physical environment, the soils, the sun, what the climate environment is, and other organisms there. So a native plant has evolved in a place and has relationships with these other things that also evolved there. So native plants are part of a larger ecosystem and the food webs within it. They're all interconnected. So just think of it as a whole, and our soils and our climate, these plants are adapted to that. So they have relationships with native wildlife. So that's why they're beneficial. Now, there are non-natives that can provide wildlife value, but researchers in general, they find if you look overall, native plants are going to provide more wildlife value than non-natives. So let's talk about some nuances related to native plants. On the left-hand side first, a native plant, that's the geographical area can be big or small when you're talking about how you're defining the word native. So you could say that, well, a plant's native to North America. So it's found somewhere in North America and it evolved here. It evolved or developed here. Or it's native to the US or native to Arizona or native to Maricopa County. So you can get narrower and narrower with your definition or broader. Just for as a couple of examples, the seed library, when I say something's locally native, I mean it's a Maricopa County native. When I say something's bioregionally native, it's any plants that evolved in the wider Sonoran Desert or are adjoining deserts. And so I include plants from both of those. So just kind of, because there's sometimes some controversy about native plants. So those are just some definitions to think about. And then on the right-hand side, we have introduced and invasive. So an introduced plant is one that did not evolve in a given location, but it was brought there from somewhere else, and maybe intentionally or unintentionally. Like when people came here from Europe, they brought plants that were native to Europe and introduced them. Some things get introduced accidentally as well. An introduced plant isn't necessarily bad. It just didn't evolve here, and it's probably not going to have relationships with native wildlife like some of those pictures we saw. Now, an invasive is a specific type of non-native that actually is harmful. It's aggressive, it crowds out native species, so it's actually harmful. So an introduced plant is generally maybe neutral or benign, but an invasive plant is negative to wildlife. So keep those in mind as just some definitions to have. And then you often hear of xeriscape versus native, or you hear about, both these things, but how are they similar or how are they different? So a xeriscape plant, by definition, is a plant, it could have evolved anywhere, Australia, desert in South America, but it's drought tolerant. So xeriscape plant is drought tolerant no matter where it is native to. So all of our native plants here in general, by definition, are drought tolerant, some more of a degree than others. Um, but then you also have xeriscape plants that are not native, but they are drought tolerant. So just some definitions and a couple of points. We did make the ecological points. These are kind of reasons why you want to do this. Ecological, I think we made some of those points. Economics, we made those points. Health, there's a lot of reasons. I think I kind of covered them. The other one I could mention too is when you have habitat at home with native plants, you're using less, hopefully, pesticides because they're really less needed, and that's also another health benefit. There's moral and spiritual considerations as far as supporting wildlife and native plants, and there's also aesthetics, like the slide here with the hibiscus. That is a native hibiscus to the Sonoran Desert, and so that's one of our. There's many beautiful plants, and I'm still continuing to discover those. So there's lots of reasons to engage in this, and so this whole effort is called sort of urban restoration or habitat at home. You'll hear it under different, or supporting wildlife at home. So there's a lot of different wildlife that can be supported, and I just give some of the main examples. Insects, birds, and small reptiles are generally the things you'll see in a typical home landscape. And there's many different types of those things. Notice I didn't put mammals on here. They kind of fall under what I consider maybe they can be more of a nuisance as some of the mammals. When you think about javelinas, you think about pack rats, rabbits. I mean, these are herbivores, and so because they eat plants, they can be nuisances to us. But unfortunately, when we support wildlife, we're not just going to support the wildlife we like, but it will bring in nuisance species, which are probably going to come anyway, because I seem like I can't escape these things, no matter what I do. But so that's just kind of a part of it, like living in the Sonoran Desert. And next week, I'm really going to hit on this a lot, is this idea that if you support native bees, which we'll talk about next week quite a bit, a habitat that meets the needs of native bees will support pretty much everything else in the food chain, all other types of wildlife with those practices. And we'll be talking about some of that today, but a lot of it more specific next week if you're able to join. So we did mention that there are several things in the home landscape: food cover, nesting and overwintering sites, and the absence or reduction of things that are harmful to wildlife. Just go through them a little bit here and then come back. Um, so food. So native flowering plants. Native flowering plants provide nectar and pollen. Nectar is a sweet substance that provides energy, and pollen is a protein source primarily used by native bees to help provision their nests for their young. It's a protein source. And so you have your pollinators, right, using native flowering plants as energy sources. Native larval host plants. These are plants that butterflies and moths lay their eggs on. So that's a food source. Those native larval host plants are food sources for the butterflies and moths. And then insects. insects are needed to be food for reptiles and birds. And so you need to have the native flowering plants, and the larval host plants to get the insects, which then supports the reptiles and birds. So remember food chains and food webs. So that cover, right? Think of especially lizards and some of the birds, they like to be able to hide under the cover of shrubs or in spiny plants. So that's important. Nesting and overwintering sites, I'm not going to get into that too much because the Xerxes Society, where I have that link, they do a really good job of talking about this. And this is something a lot of people don't think about, especially because, we're not in the Northeast. We don't have a lot of leaves, but we do have a lot of other litter, which includes plant stems and things, brush piles and things like that. So I'm going to ask you maybe to go back and take a look at that in a little more depth if that interests you. And that's something that you can do as well. And then we'll be talking about um, reducing or eliminating pesticides, changing outdoor lighting if needed, and eliminating invasive species. So now I'm going to come out of this for a second, make sure I didn't lose anyone. Hopefully, I'm going to go back to stop share. And I guess my question to you is to put in the chat, what motivates you to support wildlife in whatever sort of outdoor spaces you have. So if you don't mind to put something into the chat, I'd love to hear what people are thinking. And hopefully I didn't lose anyone with the audio. Okay, great. Thank you guys. I'm seeing some of the comments come in. Oh, wow. Thank you. I'm just reading through the comments and appreciating those. I think too, spreading the word is really important, because I didn't think about this. It's just not something that you're going to automatically think about, right? Unless you start to get involved with people or, you kind of, it's just not something that we automatically might think about. So I'm going to go ahead and um, let's see. Hopefully I can remember how to do this again. Share the screen. Oh, I have to do there's two steps. I have to share the screen down here and bring that back up. And whoops, share. Actually, it might be a question. Maybe I didn't want to. Let me see what's next. Okay. Actually, just because I think I'm going a little slower than I expected, I'm only on the first section. I'm going to see in the chat if anybody has any burning questions about what we've already discussed. If not, I'm going to launch into the next thing. So I'm just going to go back over here to, um, gosh, I wish that Zoom would find a way to be able to allow people to see everything when they're the presenter. I'm going to stop the share. I'm just going to see if I don't see something kind of burning question come up. There's going to be question and answer at the very end, and I'm happy to stay beyond 7:30 if there's anyone who wants to stay. But I will get through our primary content in the time. So I don't see anything right now. Looks like everything is working as far as the audio, which I'm thankful of. And I'm going to go ahead and get back into slideshow view and get into how to modify a typical Phoenix landscape to support wildlife. I've been thinking about this for a while. And these are pictures I took off of Google Images of some typical landscapes in the Phoenix metro area. And hopefully these are nobody's house. I just took them off Google Images. I have no idea where they, whose they are. But I want to talk about each of these and talk about how you might improve them. And then once we get through the four, then I think I have kind of a couple slides that go over them again in a little more detail. So take a look at this yard, right? And I think this yard has some really good elements for supporting wildlife and some that can be improved on. So first of all, there are some native plants here. There's some cacti, there's saguaros. There is a lantana, which is a non-native that provides nectar. So those are some things. There is orange bells in the background, and they didn't shear it, so that's really good. Um, but there are some sheared bushes. So I'm just going to go ahead and bring up all of my points here. So one thing that you can do in this type of a habitat, because we're talking about small steps, right, is not to go start ripping out all your non-native plants and putting in natives, but just when non-natives do die, when you lose them, you can start to replace them with natives as a small incremental thing. You can do a few each year, or however that works, right? So it's not like having to do some major transformation, because we know that the non-natives in general are going to provide more wildlife. There's some shrubs here being hedged, or I should say, they're being just sheared, right? So I think those might be sages, and so there's no blooming. So those flowers, so insects and other utilizers of flowers of the nectar are being denied those flowers. Plus, they don't look. I personally think they don't look as nice because you don't get to see flowers. So, and I see this everywhere. It's just everywhere you look, there are landscapers that are just shearing shrubs, and they never get to flower. And I think this is really tragic and an easy step to fix. So, another one that is really important is if you want to support wildlife, especially in Phoenix, because we have a year-round climate that supports pollinators are active year-round. Birds, they don't go into really hibernations here. Things are active year round. So we need flowers year round. So we'll talk about it again, I think another section, but you can start to inventory what you have and see, do I have something always in bloom? Is there something blooming in winter, spring, summer, fall? That's really important because these pollinators are active year round. So this yard, this yard actually might not do a bad job because it has orange bells, which does bloom quite a bit, and lantana. So it might make the grade on that one, but you want to look at that for yours. And the other one is the one I see that's glaring here is that I don't see any larval host plants. I don't know, maybe there's something I'm not seeing, but none of these plants that I'm aware of have are hosts for butterfly or moth eggs and larvae. So butterflies aren't going to lay eggs on any of these plants. They can't reproduce here. So those would be some things you can change about this yard. Also, I think I did have one. It's a little bit too messy. If you look back at Xerxes, like I mentioned, and the leaves idea, um, you could leave it a little messier. It depends. HOAs and things come into play too. Well, let's look at this next one. So this one is really cool because it's really green, right? It's like really green. But it has some issues. It's actually not wildlife friendly. And so here's some of the things I think are lacking. Nothing's flowering right now. Well, I mean, technically that grass is flowering, but those don't produce nectar. And I think that might be one of our invasive grasses. Uh, so you want to have year-round nectar. Nothing's flowering here. So butterflies, bees, birds, there's nothing for them to make use of here for nectar or pollen. There's quite a bit of grass. Grass, when it comes to these non-native grasses like this grass, it's like a dead zone for wildlife. It doesn't do anything. That could be reduced or eliminated. You could even reduce it by even a small amount and start putting in wildflowers, let's say here. Um, Butterflies and moths, I don't see any larval host plants here in this yard, so that's another problem too. And plant placement, those agaves on the driveway, I mean, whew, that's going to really hurt someone if they run into those. So that's just not really wildlife related, but just another design principle. So it's really beautiful and green, but it's not, you might as well just have fake plants there because it's not going to, that stuff really isn't going to support a whole lot of wildlife. And now we have the minimalist yard. And this one is, oh, beautiful lines, right? It's really aesthetic, but I think it's ecologically dead because there's nothing other than maybe some, agaves, maybe, but you have maybe artificial grass. So there's nothing in bloom. So there's nothing that pollinators can utilize at all. There's nothing that butterflies or moths can use to reproduce. There's no shade, so this is going to be a really hot space. There are plenty of native trees that can be added. You could add one, you could add a few that can provide shade. and starting to cut back on that astroturf. So, I mean, this is for someone if they don't want to support, maybe they don't know it, or maybe they're not thinking of it, they're not going to be able to support wildlife in a habitat like this, but it can be slowly changed. You can start to add some things in. Wildflowers could be sown right into that gravel area, at least, and possibly maybe you could start to remove some of those agaves, but you could at least, those gravel areas could become patches of very nice wildflowers at a minimum, if they wanted to start to provide some wildlife habitat. Now, you can also do some of these things with an apartment complex, right? So terraces can be used for potted plants, and I do have a list here of some that you can try. For sure, and also, I mean, someone, if they're a resident here, they could try to advocate for maybe cutting back on some of the grass. That might be a big ask, but at minimum, they can do things in their terrace and potted plants. And so there is a list here of ones that can be tried. And I think the next slide has someone who's on the pollinator pathway. He has a certified habitat just with pots, and you can see that he's got a butterfly larvae on the left on a milkweed, and then you can see him again on the right-hand side with some nectar plants there as well. So it's possible to do that in pots. So even on small space like that can provide wildlife value. These are just some quick pictures before and after of how someone transformed front yard to provide for wildlife, and a larger transformation at the Mesa High School. So just some other things that are possible. So now I'm just going to go through these. We kind of touched on most of these, but I'm just going to hit a few that maybe I'm going to look at the action on the left and then across to the benefit, the why. So we did touch on most of these except I'm going to touch on reduce or eliminate pesticide use. So there's a big body of evidence that pesticides are harmful to wildlife and humans. And I think for the most part, they can be unnecessary in a landscape. We'll talk about that in the next step. And I'm just going to go ahead and mention the bottom one because we didn't really talk about that. Don't accidentally, if you can manage it, pull native seedlings. These are volunteers, things that might come up in your space. You can start to learn to recognize them just by observation, and you can start to figure out what you have. Conversely, do pull the invasives. Let's take a look at some pictures. These are some native plants that I've learned to identify when they're young. I don't unfortunately have pictures of them all as seedlings here, but I do have the desert marigold picture as a seedling. These are all plants that people sometimes think of as weeds, but I've discovered that hand sans head sorry, head sand mat, hard to pronounce. I thought it was a weed, but it's actually a native plant, and it supports what is believed to be the smallest bee in the world, which happens to be here in the Sonoran Desert, called Perdita minima. You can see how small it is compared to the fingernail. And so that one is one, and I'm starting to really appreciate those flowers too. At first, I thought it was this ugly weed, and I tried to pull them, and now I'm hoping they come back. So, and also this flat crown buckwheat as well. I thought that was a weed, and that's another native too. And you can see some of the value there. It's a bird seed source and host plant for 3 butterfly species. So by pulling these things, you won't get those wildlife values, and a few others there as well. So there are native plants you can start to identify them as seedlings. If you ever have something in your yard you're not sure of, you can send me a picture through email. I can try to figure it out, or there's a botanist that I also is really that I know that is good at identifying them. So it's nice to know because you can start to control what comes up in your yard, pull the things you don't want, and keep the ones you want. So removing invasive species, these are the ones, remember, that are aggressive. And the 3 pictured here are ones that are considered most threatening at this time. So there is more information on that link that you can journey to find out more about these plants and how to remove them. But that could be a whole workshop in and of itself. So I'll pass on that for now. A few other things. You can ensure year-round flowering by going to that QR code. I probably should have put it as a link too. But that is a document that I created that has bloom seasons of of our various native plants, and you can kind of do an assessment like what native plants do I have, and then when do they bloom, and when do I have gaps? Do I have a gap in the summer? Do I have a gap in the winter? And then start to just target and add a few plants in that are for that time of year. Sowing native seeds is an easy way to add more native plants in. It's no cost if you go get them from the seed library. It can be no real work. A lot of times I just throw seeds into my gravel and things come up. I have like 15 buckwheats that have come up, the native buckwheat, just from throwing seed out there last year, and they're thriving now. And I didn't water them all summer. You can add larval host plants. That same QR code that's at the top of the screen, top left, also has links to or lists of larval host plants that are native to our area and which butterflies or moss they support. Hummingbird feeders. We don't need the dye. It doesn't help attract the birds, and it might be harmful. So, but keep those clean because, especially in the summer, they can breed. Fungus can grow in them, and it can really impact hummingbirds. They can get a fungal disease from it, and that can kill them. Um, Tilling or amending soil. If you're talking about native sort of, I don't want to call them ornamental or landscape plants, but we're not talking about a food garden. We're talking about native plants out for wildlife in the landscape. Those don't need tilling or amending. They're adapted to the soils already. I plant them directly in the native soil that where I live. Um, Outdoor lighting. Not gonna talk about it too much, but the QR code will take you to I think it's a Dark Skies organization that will give you an assessment of what's going on with your outdoor lighting and how you can make it less harmful to wildlife. And keep sharing and learning. I think that's really important. This is a selection of high value native plants or high value for wildlife. And so there's a key, you could see what they are, whether they're N if they're nectar, F if they're a larval host plant, a food plant, we call it hummingbird, or a cover plant. And you can see a lot of these do multiple duties. You know, like the milkweed is not just a larval host for monarchs and queens, but it's also a nectar plant for lots of other pollinators. So it does double duty. And honestly, if you are able to get just a couple of these plants in your space, these are some of the ones I found that are generally available at nurseries. Some of them, I think all of them except for two, we have in the seed library. This would be a really great place to start, even if you had just a couple of these in a space as far as providing a wildlife value. So if you don't mind in the chat, and I'm going to check the time. Oh, we're doing better. Okay, I kind of caught myself up a little bit. Go ahead and put in the chat um, of these different actions we discussed, and there was a lot. I hit you with a lot in a short amount of time. What might you implement right away? Remembering that this can be small steps, do something small. And then later on, when you have more time or energy, add something else, and so that idea of sort of incremental changes, there's a lot of options, right? And a lot of them I think are relatively easy. So I'm just going to go ahead and stop sharing for a minute so I can see the screen and see the chat. Oh, great. Yes. And if we can convince our neighbors to do some of these things too, because it could be contagious. Maybe you can start a something in your on your block or something. Yeah, these are great, and there's probably a lot of other ideas too. I'm kind of looking through these. Yeah, and so I want to mention too that the seed library. If you're able to get to a location, it's still not too late to put in some wildflowers. We're in November now. A lot of our wildflowers do need a cold period of a relative cold period. We're in the desert before they'll germinate. It's called stratification. So it's good to get those in as soon as possible. This would be like, the poppies or the lupins, the penstemons. Those would be really good if you could get them in as soon as possible. Because otherwise they won't have enough time to go through that cold period. There's other things you could put in at any time and don't require like a cold period. Um, but for sure, this is the best time to plant. So if you're seeing maybe you want to, pull out some or not pull, but you have something maybe dead you want to replace, or you have a place to add, putting a couple of plants in now is a really good time. So what I'm going to do next is it looks like things are going pretty smoothly, and I'm going to go ahead and share again and go back to slideshow. And I'm going to skip burning questions and save them for the end so I can make sure to do our final segment. Just so I make sure that I'm kind of doing everything I promised as far as the different topics, sourcing, planting, maintenance, and beyond. So, and this is another amazing habitat. And you can see on the right-hand side how in this yard they created like a wildlife corridor, with these blooming plants, right in this little larger kind of riprap, spot in the yard. So unfortunately, there is limited availability in Phoenix for finding native plants. This has been a very vexing issue. I do find that some nurseries, such as Summerwinds, A&P, and Whitfield, will have a small selection of natives. You can ask them. Actually, that QR code with the link on the bottom, that is I'm trying to remember. That is a list from the Native Plant Society that talks about which nurseries tend to have which native plants, which I don't know if it's completely up to date, but it could be a starting point. There are plant sales. Unfortunately, I believe those that I've listed, they've all finished now for the fall. Watch for spring ones. The seed library is open year-round except summer. So in May, we'll pull seeds and not start again until August. But you have up till then to get seeds there. Um, Big box, like your Home Depots or Lowe's, I found that I can find like cacti and succulents there. I've gotten, bare root ocotillos, all sorts of different cacti and succulents. They're not as good, they're not really that good on, native shrubs and other things like that. And they do, when they have them, sometimes they have cultivars. These are ones that have been bred for some trait and they may not be beneficial for wildlife or they could be harmful. If you have questions about that, you can ask me a little more at the end. I won't get into that too much, but sourcing is challenging. A lot of people that get really into this do drive to Tucson, to Desert Survivors, or Spadefoot and a couple others in Tucson and get, annually maybe and get a bunch of plants. I used to go down and get a bunch of plants to plant each fall. And I did build a pretty big, sizable garden that way. But it's not necessary to do all that. Even, like I said, a fraction of those 10 high wildlife value plants will be a good start, a really good start, and really can do a lot. This, I cannot emphasize plant placement enough. This is like one of the things that I spend a lot of time on. I walk around and around and around before I make a decision on where to put a plant. And these three things, especially trees, you really want to put a lot of thought into it before you make that decision. Especially look at that one of the Palo Verde at the bottom. Um, very poor pruning as well as placement. So here are the three things that you want to think about if you're going to plant something. How big is it going to be? What needs does it have for light and water? And is there something I want to get out of this or avoid? What is something I want to get out of planting this plant in this spot, or is something I want to avoid? So let's take them one by one. Expected size at maturity, um, especially trees. So there's links there to two things that you can check the expected size of the plant. And so look to see the height and the width expected and add a little more because I found a lot of my plants were on drip irrigation. They got bigger than the expected sizes, and I had to do a lot of removals. And that's like something you just don't want to do, right? I mean, that's heartbreaking. You're pulling out a native plant and the work involved, don't make more work for yourself. And if ever in doubt, find a different spot or find a different plant, Um, so that the size is really important. Light and water requirements, those same sources, especially Desert Survivors, they tell me a lot about, is it full sun, part sun, does it need what level of water? So I check all those things before I, kind of decide where I'm going to put it. Am I going to put it in full sun or what am I going to do? We put it under a tree. Where am I going to put this plant? And then do I want to block something with it? Well, then pick out a shrub that's going to be evergreen or a windscreen. Same thing. Evergreen ones are really good for windscreening. Or do I want some sort of color combination I really like, So those sort of things too, which are just maybe extras. That one's really important. And we know fall's the best time for planting because the soil is still warm from the previous summer and it gives the plant the longest duration before the next summer. So this is ideal. I do plant at other times. I think planting in April and May is kind of risky. I lose more plants when I plant them in April and May. They don't have as much time to establish. Cacti, I believe you can plant them at other times. I've planted trees in the summer, no problem, as long as they have, drip. But for most of my natives, I do planting in the fall. And they do need, they need tending, especially if you do it earlier, right? If you did any planting in September or October this year, you had to really baby those plants because they were getting hit with temperatures they're not accustomed to at that time, quite high. So fall's the best time, but you can plant some things at other times. You got to think about watering, right? Are you going to have drip? Are you going to have to hand water? Are you going to be on vacation? Is somebody else going to water? Can you maybe get a couple plants on the same dripper? Can you do things to your space which are do require some inputs? Notice that on the left, all the water is going to run off that yard, but on the right, there's these basins that are going to catch the water and slow the water down. If you slow the water down, the water can go deeper into those plants. And you don't want all that water to run off into the street. So you might be able to, even do a small bed, and now you don't have to do this big landscape transformation. You could, if you have a space, you might be able to make, one bed for wildflowers even. You do need some observation and trial and error for your watering. It's hard to give anybody like a big rule of thumb. And rainwater harvesting, that right-hand side picture, that is considered passive. Well, it's actually both because they have a rain tank. A rain tank catches water off the roof. That's active rainwater harvesting, and passive is the catching it in the basins. So those are some things you could think about as well. I am not a big advocate of pruning. In fact, I almost don't prune at all unless it's a tree and we can't get under it, or there's a something in blocking the way of, a walkway. But if you do good plant placement, going back to a couple of slides ago, the better your plant placement, the less likely you're going to need to prune. So there's just some couple of points about trees and shrubs, and regenerative if you choose to. I think that's optional. I don't do that one. Maybe I should. Actually, I guess we did do that with some jojobas, and they've come back very lush. But that resource is from the extension office, and that will get into pruning because I don't have a lot of expertise in pruning, because I choose not to do that. I want the plants to grow in their natural form. I think that's how they're beautiful. Managing pest problems. Well, I guess my question would be is, do you actually even have a pest problem, right? Because when you're planting primarily native plants, they don't tend to have a lot of pest problems. And if you do see some sort of bloom, I guess I'll call it a bloom, or a burst of insect activity around some plants, it's usually short-lived. Um, and a lot of times, what people would consider pests are actually a natural part of the ecosystem, like aphids. Look at the leaf there on the right, right? Ladybug, a good plant, right? A good bug, not good plant. A good bug we consider ladybugs. Aphids, maybe not so much. So the thing is they're all on the same leaf. If we start, spraying pesticides onto those leaves, we're going to kill the good and the bad. So, and aphids are really a natural part of the ecosystem anyway, and they provide, some food for other things in the food chain and things like that. So the thing is, a lot of times is these pesticides are broad. They're going to kill all your insects. They're going to kill, not just the ones you don't want. So trying to get people away from doing too much of spraying, and it's really not necessarily. We do treat around the base of our house for scorpions, things like that, but I don't spray any of my plants at all. But there are ways that you can do more gentler control if you know what you have. Fire ants, you can use Amdro. For mammals, you can try to exclude them, And then integrated pest management, if you Google that, that really talks about this whole way of thinking where you look and say, well, do I even have a pest problem? And if so, is there a way to treat it without chemicals first, And it takes you through a whole series of steps, prevention, before having to actually, take some sort of action that could be harmful. So that's just some 2 cents worth on that. So now in the next couple slides, and you'll have the links, so you don't have to worry about writing any of these down. I have links to various things that could be really helpful here. I don't think any real comment. Um, the rainwater harvesting. Yep, that's actually the group that's really has a lot of expertise on this is in Tucson. Um, let me see. Oh, this is great. So next week, I'm going to be talking about how to attract and support pollinators, getting into more depth about the pollinators themselves and their needs, especially native bees, and specific practices that go beyond what we talked about. So I hope if you can join to join that. And somehow, I don't know how I managed to get there. I was a little worried I was going to run over, so I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. And I'm gonna actually see if I can turn off the recording if I can remember how to do that. There we go. I think I